computer, and then we're going to start. Okay. I want to talk about obviously the topic ending child abuse, poverty, slavery, and those three key points. I had an interesting comment exchange with someone earlier. I think it was today or yesterday. And I had made a post and I talked about this particular post in another video I did yesterday, but it was the same post, different commenter. And the post that I made was saying that, Jesus said that we should love our neighbor as ourselves. And yet it seems like we're being impulsed to fear our neighbor. And how can we love our neighbor while still accepting a system that creates inequality on a consistent automatic basis? And to clarify what I mean by that, like, let me give you an example. Why is there child slavery? Why is it that in many third world countries, children have to, from a very young age, 5 or 6, even go out and work to provide for their families? Or why do children have to work in diamond mines or things like that in Africa? Or why are children abused? If you just look at the point of child slavery in terms of them working, it's because of the economic system that we have that doesn't support everyone effectively, is highly competitive, and is based on your education level, which your education level is based on how much money you have for the most part, at least your education in terms of your ability to make money in the system. And when it comes to child abuse, you can see very clearly the influence of money in that, and education level, where a parent would abuse their child emotionally, physically, sexually, because of mental health issues. And you call it mental health, but it's really just mental disorder. It's not having been supported from a very young age themselves to have a very clear, effective understanding of the world and how to treat another person as you would want to be treated. And instead, we have all kinds of issues going on psychologically, which then can come out in the form of physical abuse, emotional abuse, sexual abuse. Why do people abuse drugs and alcohol? Because there's a lot of child abuse that occurs because people are rather using and abusing alcohol. And so just that alone, why are people using alcohol? Why are they abusing it? Because they're stressed. They want to escape from their mental demons, so to speak. And, in terms of poverty, obviously that goes kind of hand in hand with the point I made about child slavery. But it's the same thing, the economic system, the education system. And in a broader sense, the education system is what has brainwashed everyone in the world to accepting the system, the larger system, the economic system, political system, legal system, the way it is, which is what allows for these things. And so I wanted to share this point. Let me see if I can get the things pulled up here. Where is that one I wanted to share? So I've covered up the person's name, so it's not personal, but let's see, where did it go? Here it is. Okay. But this person was making this point that, because they had said that the point about us accepting a system but still valuing all life equally, or being able to love our neighbor, was more a matter of just compassion. And if we lived compassion, then it wouldn't be an issue. And I made up the point that you wouldn't say that if you were being abused sexually, if you were a child being raped, or if you were dying of starvation. And then this person said that they were in fact molested when they were 5 and abducted when they were 7. And they said, but here's the key point: that doesn't define mankind, though. There's so much goodness in people everywhere, even if they are asleep. And I needed to realize that. Thank you. So my response, you can see here, there is goodness, however, it is not allowed to shine because of the systems that we allow, which perpetrate evil. Those are what must be adjusted so that the ability for man to love his neighbor as himself is automatic as breathing. And I'm going to go back to my original picture here, because the reason, first of all, why I said the original comment, which I didn't show, But the reason I said you wouldn't say that if you were being abused is because when you're in that moment of actual physical abuse, there is no God present. There is no help. There is simply you and the abuse that you're experiencing. And this is what animals experience on a daily basis, plants experience, we experience, children, adults, we experience abuse on a daily basis, just by even as simply from participating in the system and just being used as just pieces within a consumer system that is literally just consuming us to keep generating money with no care what our experiences, what our lives are actually like, what we're actually feeling and expressing and living as on a daily basis. And so the the problem is, and I think the person who made that comment really showed this, is as a child you're kind of powerless to do anything about it. And even as adults, I think we many times can feel powerless to do anything about the system that exists. So we just accept it. And then we look for the good within it instead of realizing, no, I have to stand up and do something about this. Because, although I empathize with that person for the abuse that they've experienced, saying that, your experience of being molested and being abducted and all those kind of things doesn't define mankind. Well, it does define the experience of many people on this planet. And by saying, but I'm going to use that opportunity to look for the goodness, it's like this belief that you are, in fact, not good. And therefore, you have to prove yourself by looking for the good. Like, if I can prove that I'm able to look for the good no matter what the negative is, then I'll somehow be worthy. Instead of, no, I'm going to look for the evil and I'm going to stop the evil. I'm going to look for that which is not best, and eradicate that which is not best. And that doesn't mean I have to use force. I can use communication. I can use legal means. I can use politics. I can adjust the money system. I made a video yesterday, I believe, depending on when you're watching this. It's my previous live stream 006, where I talked about the point of using communication to improve the world. And I think that because our education level is so low, and even if you went to MIT, you still have a low education because you're not seeing the bigger picture. You're just seeing your specialization. So what we define as a high level of education is not really, because you don't see everything. You don't see how it all interconnects. You don't see how you can do anything about it, about changing the world so that it's best, so that you can end child slavery, poverty, and abuse globally. And because our actual vocabulary, our actual ability to stand in the system and do something and change it legally through political means, our ability to do that, our vocabulary with which we're using to try to understand the problem is so ineffective that we just instead feel powerless. And so we then find justifications instead of what can I actually personally do. And that's why I made that video for the previous one about how communication can improve the world. Uh, that's that live stream I was referring to, because I wanted people to see very clearly my perspective of, no, you can personally do something. It is a function of you improving your ability to communicate so you can talk about the problems clearly and you can give the solutions clearly, because the solution is always going to be political, because that is how we implement change on a mass scale in our society. It's not going to be through protesting, which is like, protesting is promoted as a way of solving political problems, but it's not. It never changes anything. All it does is create revolutions at the most extreme end, which, as we can see from history, always just replace the haves with the have-nots, who become the haves. And it's dialectic cycle that Marx talked about. That's the whole point of revolution. It's like a virus where people would otherwise have been able to stand within politics and present real solutions that can be voted upon, one man, one vote. Instead, it becomes a point of, let's just protest and demand that our government do something. Well, that's like demanding that the abuser stop. It's not going to work. You have to become equal to the point of authority and responsibility so that you can change it. And the best way to do that is to stand within politics and the legal system and stand for within principles of what's best for all. And then present the solution and have people vote on it. And of course, as I mentioned before in the other video, that's gonna be a problem if the population is not educated. And just to go further into this point though, and I really want people to see this problem very clearly, is like just saying like, oh well, there humanity has such goodness in it, and I can find that and not worry about the abuse, and I can look past my abuse. No, abuse is not acceptable, and it can be prevented. And if you instead simply say, oh well, I'm looking for the good, so that's fine, then you're not doing anything to change the system, which is what's creating that abuse, because you're not looking at why did that person abuse you, what was going on within them, what were the conditions of their life and their reality and their existence that developed them and impulsed them and influenced them into that position where that choice seemed reasonable to them. At some level, it seemed like for them it was the best thing. And it's obviously within self interest, but why is self interest seen as the highest value? And I was looking up some statistics. Let me see if I can share that. Where's that? It's like here. And it's quite fascinating. Child sexual abuse statistics. This is just sexual abuse. It says 1 in 10 children will be sexually abused before their 18th birthday. 1 in 7 girls and 1 in 25 boys will be abused before they turn 18, sexually abused. There are about 400,000 babies born in the US this year that will become victims of sexual abuse unless we do something to stop it. Um, the primary reason that only 38% of child victims disclose the fact, oh, hold on, even with declining rates that we're not really fully aware, is because only 38% of victims disclose that they've been abused. Some never disclose. Obviously, there's privacy issues. But there was something specific in here I wanted to show you in the context of this discussion here, which is right here. It says, fact, not everyone who sexually abuses children is a pedophile. And it goes into this interesting point, which is child sexual abuse is perpetrated by a wide range of individuals with diverse motivations. It is impossible to identify specific characteristics that are common to all those who molest children. Situational offenders tend to offend at times of stress and begin offending later than pedophilic offenders. They also have fewer victims and a general preference for adult partners. And then they show there's just difference in the patterns between what they call apparently a pedophilic offender and then just a non-pedophilic, what they call a situational offender, which I had never even considered that there would be a difference. But it makes sense, meaning you have the person who's driven from the perspective of sexual desire versus there are other reasons why people abuse children sexually. It could be, for the same point of why, there may be people who rape, as adults, they might rape other people, or, a man might rape a woman, not necessarily from sexual desire, although that obviously could be a big point, but also from the perspective of dominance or control or punishment or all kinds of things. So there's a lot of stuff that goes into that. The reason I wanted to point that out is just to kind of highlight the point of even within the statistics, they're recognizing the difference and saying that there's things like stress, for example, that can cause people to do things they wouldn't otherwise do. They don't have any pattern of doing and don't do again necessarily. And that doesn't obviously justify or ameliorate the point in any way, but it highlights the point that that much of this, or some of this in any case, is preventable, because you have situations where um, you're doing things under stress or under pressure that you wouldn't normally do. Like, for example, think about the person who commits suicide. If they weren't under immense stress and pressure, I'm sure there's many suicide cases, because you look at the ones, for example, the farmers in India who, had the GMO crops that didn't yield, and then they all killed themselves because they were under debt and all this stuff. Like they weren't like depressed people who were just depressed about life. Like they had a specific stress, financial stress they couldn't solve. They killed themselves. And so there's so many ways in which the system that we're participating in and that we're accepting and allowing creates the conditions for which these things become sort of the obvious outlet. Suicide being one of them, child abuse being another one. But then there's also the abuse that's not sexual, which is like physical abuse, emotional abuse, where a parent will just not even necessarily purposefully, but they will abuse their child in subtle or not so subtle ways simply because that's how they were treated by their parents, or they believe that it's their role as a parent to simply punish their child no matter if the child does anything that the parent sees as not acceptable behavior, because they have a fear that otherwise the child will grow up to not be able to survive, or they'll get into more trouble, or might reflect poorly on the parent. There's so many dimensions to the point as to why a parent would abuse their child, and not necessarily do it from the perspective of they meaning to do it. So, and that's difficult for I think many parents to be self-honest about, that they abuse their children without doing it on purpose. And it doesn't mean that you don't care about your child, but and you say, "Well, I love my child, I would never abuse them." It doesn't matter if you love them. What matters is whether you abuse them or not. So just because you feel a certain way about your child and you get emotional when you think about them, or you imagine someone hurting them or whatever, if you're still doing things that are not in their best interest, that is abusive. And so you have to really be honest with yourself, because then there's room for change. And then there's all the environmental factors that come into play, in terms of your limitations as a parent with time, the fact that you have to work, the stress that you experience on a daily basis because of the money system that we live in, and your education, which you didn't necessarily, and well, you didn't um, direct yourself. Someone else directed it. So you're a victim of that to a certain degree. Doesn't mean you can't change it now. And for some people, they may not be much they can do to change their circumstances, just depending on where they're at and what they have access to at the moment. But really, the main point I want to drive here is that it's the system that we live in is largely responsible for the outcomes that we're seeing. And so, even though on an individual level, people can take responsibility depending on their access to the tools that we're talking about, like Destiny and Technotutor, for example, the real change fundamentally is going to come when the system changes. For example, when we have a money system, a monetary system that values life rather than just profit, um, and is designed in a way where it considers what is the balance, and is there anybody who's lacking? Is there anybody who's is on the negative end of the balance of the scales? And what can we do to balance things out more effectively? And that doesn't mean that everyone has to be brought down to a level of poverty. And I understand the objections people have about communism and socialism, and I don't ascribe to those things. Um, I don't subscribe to those things, but that doesn't mean you should justify inequality because there are systems that are also ineffective. It is simply because with something like communism or socialism, it's done within the context of, we still have ultimately at the end of the day the profit motive as the starting point of the money system, and it's a global money system. So if the value of life is not equal across the board in terms of what is the value of money, then there's always going to be a winner and a loser. And so what you see is the communist and socialist systems being the losers within the capitalist game. Doesn't mean that we can't have a form of capitalism. We still have to look at what is our starting point within it. Is it to actually improve the balance of life for everybody? Is it to end child slavery, poverty, and abuse? Or is it to simply, for some to who have the education and the ability and the ruthlessness to get rich while most people starve and most people suffer? It's not acceptable. So when you look at, for example, Destiny and Technotutor and the starting point of these two things, these are the tools and the pathways through which an individual who wants to be a part of the solution can start taking back direction over who they are, their programming, what they're capable of, their ability to communicate. Basically, re-educate yourself with a new vocabulary of real effectiveness. It's like the cutting edge of effectiveness, the cutting edge of understanding, the cutting edge of comprehension and vocabulary, the cutting edge of making a difference, the cutting edge of spirituality. Because without rebuilding your vocabulary from the ground up and your comprehension, your understanding of the world from the ground up, starting over again, you will always bring things back to a point of rebooting the system, so to speak. And so that's really what we're looking for, is those who want to be on the cutting edge and really push themselves past all limitations, and to be able to identify the limitations they're not even aware of, and to challenge themselves so that we can eradicate things like child slavery, poverty, and abuse, because they are consequences of us continuing to accept a system that is based on the presumption that all life is not valuable equally. And as long as we continue to accept that, then you will see justification of abuse instead of, okay, let's maybe I can't do something about the fact that I was abused in the past, or this person's being abused right now, this moment, but I can do something with my life that will adjust the system so that eventually there will be no more abuse, without having to go to a point of extreme dictatorship and control of each person's life through technological means, because that is where society is headed right now. And this is what people need to understand, like, because the human is unpredictable, and because the mind is so unstable, and it's only going to compound and accelerate this nasty nature of humanity, because that's who we are inside. We have to take responsibility for that. And this isn't about religion, like feeling guilty and then, oh, I'm a sinner and I must be forgiven. No, you must forgive yourself. We are accepting and allowing this world. And so I think what happens is someone like who's abused, then they start to internalize that guilt. And then when they discover the point of, hey, I should, I should look for the good, it's because they're trying to find that point of redemption within themselves, of getting rid of these memories and this abuse they feel within themselves. But the solution is not to simply just ignore reality, but rather to really forgive yourself so that you can stand and be an example and stand in a position of really making a difference in this world. And that is, again, through political means. Now, many people might say, there's no way I could do that. And that would be for a few reasons. One, you lack the effectiveness within the ability to communicate, and also the ability to process information, and you lack the resources. And that's solvable because you simply have to develop the resources. And that could be through, for example, building a business with TechnoTutor. It could also be simply connecting with those who are already financially resourceful and have access to resources, and connecting with those so that you can uh, lend your skill set, but then have the financial backing. But at the end of the day, we have to stand as a group within principles. And as a collective, as a group within principle, we have a lot more resources at our disposal than if we try to do it individually. And I think that's the biggest challenge people have, is when they're automatically going to, well, there's nothing I can do about the world, I'll just try to look for the positive or look for the good, is because they're thinking they can only do something individually, because they don't see anybody working for the real betterment of reality and this world and life and humanity and just life itself. So there must not be a way to do it, but there is. And that's what Destiny is about. That's what TechnoTutor is about. TechnoTutor is specifically this technology to reprogram yourself at a physical level. Destiny is the principles and the tools and the understanding psychologically to be able to know how to really what to work with. It's kind of like the operating manual, so to speak, whereas the TechnoTutor is the technology. And so if you're listening to this and you're somebody who wants to stand up and you want to make a difference, and you're not willing to, and you don't want to make excuses anymore, justify abuse and suffering, then this is the group, Destiny, to stand within principle and to work as a group. And that means you're going to have to change. You're going to have to adjust yourself to the principles. The principles are not going to adjust to you. The principles do not adjust to me personally. I have to adjust myself. And this is where you're going to have to really challenge your self-interest and your desire to be the center of it, to want to be the center of attention. But the reality is, when you walk with these principles, you become more effective when you use these tools, and you will be the center of attention because people will notice and they will want to emulate you. And then they will become the center of attention for others. And then people will notice them and they will emulate. And through that, 1+1, we will make a difference. And then we'll get to the point where we can then stand as a group within principle in much bigger levels of responsibility that's not available to the average individual person, because they don't have the resources and the network to do it. And that's what I mean when we talk about politics and so forth. It's not about you just today suddenly running for politics. It's about standing within the group and building yourself and your skill level to be able to handle that position, but then also having access to the resources necessary. And as a group, we can get it done. And that's what we're here to do. So thanks for watching. Please share this video if you found it supportive, and check out my other videos on my YouTube channel to see more of my perspective and what we're doing. All right, that's all for now. Take care.